I'm pleased to rise on behalf of my constituents in Sturgeon River Parkland to declare that we have lost confidence in this Liberal government and this Prime Minister. Now, the member for Kingston and the Islands raised a very interesting point in the Q&A about his government's so-called investments in cleaning up abandoned oil and gas wells. And I'll say that I wrote the Deputy Prime Minister, the Finance Minister, a year ago to beg her to reallocate unspent funds for First Nations in my riding and across Alberta who are begging for the funds to clean up oil wells on First Nations lands. And you know what this government did? Absolutely nothing. Couldn't even be bothered to respond. In fact, just 2 weeks ago, members of Treaty 6 First Nation had to go out and publicly call on the government to provide this funding, and they didn't. They don't have a good record on oil and gas cleanup. Now, in the past 8 years, the cost of living crisis has reached new heights thanks to this government's economic mismanagement. And unfortunately, it's working-class Canadians who are expected to pay the price for Liberal incompetence. In fact, the only people who seem to be benefiting under this Liberal government are the high-paid lobbyists that these Liberals seem to have so much trouble about in this House. And it's becoming under this Liberal government, what some have called a self-licking ice cream cone. And I know my colleague from the NDP was talking about ice cream cones earlier, and that's exactly what's happening under this Liberal government, is a self-licking ice cream cone of government insiders who are petitioning and lobbying for more taxpayer money just to keep this whole thing going. That's what this Liberal government's all about. And this April Fool's Day, this Prime Minister will play a cruel joke on Canadians by hiking the carbon tax by a whopping 23%. And this means that everyday essentials like heating, groceries, and gas will cost even more. Now, the Liberals like to talk about their vaunted heat pump program. Well, there's a recent article out of Nova Scotia. 2,500 Nova Scotia families are facing record power bills from Nova Scotia Power. And you know what many of those families had in common?
I have to interrupt the honourable member. The honourable member for Timmins, James Bay, is rising on a point of order.
I think you will find, if you check the record, that claims about self-licking ice cream cones were not made by the New Democrats. We question whether the member for Stornoway actually had ever made an ice cream while he claimed to have worked at Dairy Queen, but we didn't claim that they were self-licking cones.
On a subject that is really not in the scope of this debate. The honourable member for Sturgeon River Parkland.
Well, Madam Speaker, thank you for that. You know, under this Liberal government, the cost of everyday essentials is going up. In fact, even when they talk about their much vaunted heating pump program, we have a recent story from Nova Scotia where families are facing power bills and families are saying we need one job just to live and another job just to pay our heating bills. And you know what many, if not most of these families all had in common? They all had heat pumps. The costs are rising for these families, and it's not just families that are burning oil and gas or natural gas to heat their homes. It's electricity. It's everything that's going up under this Liberal government. In fact, the average family of four will pay $700 more for groceries in 2024 because of this Liberal carbon tax. And it's quite remarkable that after years of such a stark trend that the Liberal and NDP members refuse to acknowledge the terrible impacts of their carbon tax. And with each hike, Canadians are forced to dig deeper into their pockets just to afford to live. This Liberal carbon tax is driving up the cost of everything in this country. The inflation trajectory remains uncertain. And while there is hope that inflation will come down, followed by some interest rate cuts, this Liberal government seems intent on quashing that progress with a 23% tax hike on April 1st. Madam Speaker, when the history of this government is written, it will be a story of how an out-of-touch Prime Minister has become with the challenges of working-class people. The cost of this Prime Minister's annual taxpayer-funded vacations spirals out of control at the same time that prices of essential goods that Canadians need to live are hitting 40,000 feet. It's time for the Prime Minister to admit that he's wrong, to spike his April 1st tax hike and get rid of this inflationary carbon tax for good. Now, if he's confident that Canadians support his carbon tax plan, it's time for him to call an election, give Canadians an opportunity, an electoral referendum, and give them a choice on whether or not they want this Liberal carbon tax. Now, the Prime Minister claims that the carbon tax will help the environment. It will help deal with climate change. But if that were the case, then you'd think we would have hit at least one of our climate targets by now. In fact, the Climate Change Performance Index now ranks Canada 62 out of 67 countries, dropping 4 places from last year. And after 8 years of this Liberal government's failure, it's abundantly clear that their carbon taxes are simply another reason to grab more money from hardworking Canadians. It's not an environment plan, it's a tax plan. Now, the Liberals claim that we need a carbon tax or else Canada will be beset by more floods, more fires, and more hurricanes. It's simply not true. Even the Liberals' own Environment Minister admitted that we may not see an impact from the Liberal carbon tax until, guess, 2060. Maybe by 2060 we'll see an impact from their carbon tax. Well, Madam Speaker, a young man like myself will be drawing on old age security by the time this Liberal government believes that just maybe their carbon tax will have an environmental impact. It's not an environment plan, it's a tax plan. And right now Canadians are losing their homes, they're losing their vehicles, they're skipping on meals today. They can't wait until 2060 to maybe get a result. Now we're only a quarter of the way through the year, and food banks are already predicting that they will have an additional 1 million visits. That's on top of a record-breaking year last year. Now, this government claims to be evidence-based. These are damning facts. And this Liberal government is blind to the impact that their policies are having on Canadians. Either that or they just don't care. Last year, 36% of charities had to turn people away because the charities are running out of resources. And in some cases, the demand for food has become a public safety issue. Last week in Montreal, we saw police called in to control crowds at a food bank because hundreds of more hungry Canadians showed up than were expected. These are stories reminiscent of the Great Depression, when police were deployed to disperse bread lineups. And while Canadians wait in food lineups, Liberals go out and say, "You don't have it so bad. Other countries would be glad to swap places with us." And some Liberals are even saying that Canada is doing great in comparison to Afghanistan. Well, that's setting the bar far too low for Canadians, and it's cold comfort for hungry Canadians today who are waiting in lineups. Now, it's clear that the carbon tax is not only ineffective, it's deeply unfair. And despite the promises of these rebates, the reality is most Canadian families will end up paying more in taxes than they receive in these so-called rebates. The Parliamentary Budget Officer has been abundantly clear. Canadian families will pay more than what they get back. And the average Alberta family, where I represent, will have to pay $911 in additional taxes than they will receive in rebates. Now, the Prime Minister claimed just yesterday in this House that every penny collected is returned to Canadians. It's simply not true. In fact, the Liberals are holding on to more than $2 billion in carbon taxes that they have refused to give to Canadians. In fact, they broke their promises to small businesses whose carbon tax they collected and refused to give them back the money they raised from small businesses. And that's not to mention the GST, which is charged on top of the carbon tax, a tax on a tax that's raising hundreds of millions of dollars for this Liberal government, and it's not being returned to Canadians. Not only will Canadian families pay more than they get back, but because of this Liberal government's inflationary deficits, our nation's debt has more than doubled, something that the youngest generation of Canadians will have to deal with for decades to come. Also, Canadians who have variable rate mortgages are renewing, and they're finding that their mortgages are even bigger than they were than before they started paying for it, as the cost of their interest piles up faster than their principals being paid down. And that's not just variable rate Canadians. Canadians who are renewing their fixed income mortgages, for example, this fall and next fall, are going to face more than doubling and in some cases tripling of their interest rate costs. Mortgage delinquencies right now are up by 50%, and polls show that 55% of Canadians who currently don't own a home believe they never will own a home. And that's especially true for younger Canadians. And even the average renting price for residential properties was at a record high of $2,192 in January of this year. That's a 10% increase year over year. Canadians can't afford this. They can't afford the doubling of housing costs over the last 8 years. They certainly don't have confidence that this Liberal government that made this problem happen has the solutions to fix them. And if this Liberal government is good at one thing, it's breaking promises. Their carbon tax is higher than what it was ever supposed to be. It's higher than what they ever ran on. It's certainly not revenue neutral, as the PBO has proved, and it's not helping Canadians reach their emissions targets. 70% of Canadians across 70% of the provinces are opposed to raising the carbon tax on April 1st, and the national consensus is clear. Canadians from coast to coast to coast want to spike the hike and axe the tax. Now, Madam Speaker, Canadians are sick and tired of paying absurd amounts for everyday essentials. And my constituents are contacting me every day with examples of their power bills, examples of what they're paying at the pump, and they're outraged at this cost of living crisis. They're especially outraged about the increased costs for groceries, the increased costs for home heating, not to mention the increased costs of their mortgages. And it's not only young families that are struggling, seniors, people on fixed income, those students in school, and those with disabilities are struggling. And this NDP Liberal government is not worth the cost. Canadians can see that. They want an election. And then when will the Prime Minister realize that Canadians no longer have confidence in his government? They want him to axe his inflationary carbon tax. They want an election. They want a choice. When are they going to give it to them? Thank you, Madam Speaker.